We're very fortunate today to have the opportunity to interview Hadley Arkes, a longtime leader in the natural law and pro-life scholarship area. And Hadley has taught for over 45 years at Amherst College, where he's the Edward Ney Professor. And he's also been very active in public life, perhaps especially as the advocate, the author, the proponent of the Born Alive Infant Protection Act. And so we want to talk to Hadley today about a wide variety of topics, and maybe begin with asking a little bit about his intellectual autobiography. Where did you start out intellectually?
Start out at the, Carl Schurz High School in Chicago, and then from the University of Illinois Navy Pier, taking two buses and two trains across town to make my 8 o'clock class. And these days I could get up the hill to make a 9 o'clock class if I had to do it. And from there, of course, to the only university I ever wanted to attend as a graduate school, the University of Chicago, the great place where the classes would end and we'd still be there 2 hours later, still arguing. And Jeremy Israel, I remember, would say, "Oh, you don't like it? Well, then you sit here, and you take over. You do the wrecking paper." And it was, well, of course, Chicago. I was drawn to Chicago because I had a great teacher at college that you would know, Milt Rakoff, father of Jack Rakoff. Milt was just a warm, beloved teacher, a great teacher. And he was a student of, he'd been a research assistant to Hans Morgenthau. And I became very interested in Morgenthau and the realist perspective on foreign policy. And so I was drawn to Chicago, but I heard about this Leo Strauss, that Milt was very keen on Strauss. And I mentioned that I saw my former professor, Jerry Huff, who was teaching at Duke. And I had him in his first year teaching at the University of Illinois. And he was jolted to see that there was a festschrift being done now for one of his former undergraduates. I was thinking that Bob Prenger, who taught political theory at Illinois, gave me a reading course for Strauss so I could read Natural Right and History, What is Political Philosophy, before I got to Chicago. By the time I got to Chicago, actually getting me into this, I had Morgenthau, but I really had to have solved Morgenthau. That Morgenthau was, it was really positivism drawn to international relations. It was certain realpolitik where we defend the territory. But of course, you don't simply defend the territory. What you're trying to preserve is a certain way of life, a certain regime. Politics always occurs within a regime with certain characters. As Aristotle says, you see the same people arranged as a comic chorus or a tragic chorus. And we used to tell students that we think in political science that the most consequential data of political life are the data involved in the shift in regimes from the Germany of Weimar to the Germany of Hitler, from the Cube of Batista to the Cube of Castro. I remember one youngster coming up after class saying, "This is interesting. Who's this guy Weimar?" But my problem with Morgenthau was that you come to understand that it's the regime that is the most central question in politics. In fact, Strauss had a line like this, page 137, I think, we're practically in the middle of the book, that when the classic philosophers were concerned with the question of what is the best political regime, they gave us to understand that social phenomenon, than only which the biological phenomena were more fundamental, was the political regime. The terms on which, the moral terms on which we live, the character of that life. That's why then this recent concern with marriage. There's been nothing as central to the laws, since there have been laws, as understanding what constitutes a family in a marriage. Okay. Well, so my first book was really, which came out in my dissertation at Chicago, was really a goodbye letter to Hans Morgenthau. It was called Bureaucracy, the Regime, and the National Interest. This was about the Marshall Plan, as people tried to give administrative shape to the Marshall Plan of 1947. they had to explain where this fits into the overall scheme. Did you want to take export controls away from the Department of Agriculture? Was this that important an interest? You know, and as you did that, you were trying to explain where this Marshall Plan fitted within the entire scheme of the laws and the American regime. And but then that sort of got me pointed toward Max Weber and a certain case in constitutional law. And I'd worked in constitutional law as part of the one of the fields for my PhD, but I hadn't thought of it as central. But I began moving in that direction. Amherst is a lovely small place that gives you a lot of flexibility. And I moved to a course in urban politics because people became very concerned with the cities. I was teaching on political parties.
I began back when, about the 1960s?
60s. I like to say to people, I was an inmate at Brookings, at the Brookings Institution. I was institutionalized at Brookings, and I had a fine doctoral fellowship coming right out of Chicago, 65, 66. And nestled in the Brookings Institution. And there I was really nestled in with the Democratic establishment, the liberal establishment. 1965, it was the high tide of liberalism. Evan Kirkpatrick, the head of the Political Science Association, was a dear friend of Hubert Humphrey. Hubert is now vice president. We just beaten Goldwater in a landslide in 1964. We're enacting the Voting Rights Act. We enacted the Civil Rights Act. No one was a relativist. No one was a moral relativist. They thought we were at the policies of justice. But in the fall of 65, time of high confidence about the war in Vietnam, the sense in Brookings was we were winning our war. That was a liberals' war. And there was the whole doctrines that came out of the 40s and 50s. Don't ask for whom the bell tolls. It tolls for thee. Yes, it's a small country. We don't say with Chamberlain. It's a small, distant place with a people of whom we know little. We learn not to say things like that because we don't have control over whether it's a test case. You know, Hitler knew whether it was a test case. We didn't have that kind of luxury. So the people who were persuaded about it, we were out to vindicate the right of these people, these Asian people, not to have a totalitarian regime imposed on them. And the only people who were reserved about the war were my conservative Republicans. And my dear friend Frank Waldrop, who's the legendary managing editor at the Washington Herald. And Frank would say, they want to go communist? Let them go communist, they'll sink faster. So anyway, I came from Brookings with the high confidence of the liberal establishment. And I landed at Amherst, where the opposition to the war in Vietnam was a kind of almost like a religious passion. And I came out of the University of Chicago where just brilliant people could say all things I'd never heard before. And they were conservative, and they were principled. And they thought that really principles matter. And there was a moral up and down in the universe. You know, people get in trouble for good reasons. Yes, Ho Chi Minh really is a communist. He's not merely a nationalist. He's a hardened Marxist, communist, Leninist. So I get to Amherst, and it's been true of many places. True that I remember Andre Helliger said of Johns Hopkins in this period that it wasn't a free place. It wasn't a place where you were free not to speak your mind. And we expect to say provocative things. And I thought I could do that, and yet you have the danger of people just fleeing your courses if you happen to say something that ran against the currents of the time.
I suspect you went ahead and said them anyway.
I did. But you know, you also learn how to be a little prudent. You can't really run, you know, you can't assault the reigning ethos every day. You have to learn how to be disarming and how to make these courses disarming.
What were you teaching at Amherst when you started out?
Political parties. It's not my field, but I saw a way of doing it. I had an interview with George Cato at the political science meetings, and I said, this is not my main field, and I recommended somebody else for the job. But then somewhere around January of '66, I thought, I should be back in touch with him. But a letter came saying, no, we want you to come anyway for the interview. And that led to the job. But let me just say something else about Strauss. Strauss is really quite fascinating. And I heard that, Strauss as a young man was very drawn to Nietzsche. And there are people who've written books about Strauss as a nihilist and Nietzsche. And I think that was just refuted in the first moments I saw him. If you catch a sense of the room, it was, I put many hours in Hebrew school, and it was like Hebrew school. And that light would go, the class would go, it's supposed to be an hour and a half, but it would just keep going on. There's a semicircle. First of all, there's this little man with getting the microphone set up, because they're going to tape what he says. And they would make transcripts of all his courses. And they were hovering over him were these giants, Herb Storing and Joe Cropsey, over this little man. And with a small voice. And you see, who's around this room? There were these gray-haired retired men from the military, and these young Catholic seminarians, and these aggressive Jewish kids from Chicago. One of whom I'm which, as the congressman would have said, getting caught in his own syntax. A friend of the farmer, one of whom I'm which. Okay, aggressive Jewish student from Chicago. And we said, what do these people have in common? They were all standing contra mundum. They were all standing against the currents of relativism. And what Strauss was doing, he was drawing on two sources. He was drawing on the biblical tradition, and he was drawing on the tradition of classic philosophy running back to the Greeks. So it was Jerusalem and Athens. Jerusalem and Athens. Milton Himmelfarb once remarked, when Strauss died, he said, it was Jerusalem and Athens. He said, but Strauss was not much seen in the synagogue. And I called Milton. I said, look, I heard this story before I got to Amherst. Strauss had come and given a lecture at Amherst, circa 1958, I think. He gave this talk, and one of my colleagues, in English, Alan Gutman, came up afterwards and said, but if I listened to his talk, you would have to believe in Revelation. And Strauss said, well, I'm a Jew. And I said, what does that mean these days? And Strauss said, that's not my problem. So I called Milton when Strauss died. I said, call the stories for Hadley. Look, Jerusalem and Athens, Jerusalem and Athens. His head was in Jerusalem, his heart was in Jerusalem, his head was in Athens. And the premier organ of a philosopher is the head, what he was. But what it could be said of Strauss, though, is that his students have not become raging atheists. They go to temple, they go to shul, when they're Jews, and a number of them have become Catholics. And here am I, the more implausible Catholic. But the curious thing is, he did launch me in this, and with Harry Jaffa. Harry Jaffa was really the figure. I was fascinated by Strauss and put off a bit by the Straussians. They seemed, it was that old line of Tom Stoppard, that at a certain point, the moralist starts to sound like somebody who is haranguing the bus queue with the demented certitude of one possessed of privileged information. And the Straussians seem to be of this kind of smile of smugness of people who really are possessed of privilege, and which was not accessible to me, because some of them, Jeff Burnham and Charles Obenauer, had worked with Walter Burns and Alan Bloom at Cornell. So they came in as Straussian grandchildren. And they knew this. They knew the words. They knew the moves. And this was all, I was sure this was all over my head, But then I'd leave, and I was teaching at Amherst, and I thought, wait a minute, I understand this. I could explain. If I could explain this to my 18-year-olds, why couldn't Mr. Strauss have explained it to me? And there was a Straussian answer to that question, and that was, he would work out an ellipsis, and if you could fill it in, you deserved to fill it in. And if you didn't, you're not going to go running through the landscape professing to be an apostle of Leo Strauss and misinstructing people on what Strauss taught. Okay, there's a rationale for that. But Chicago was you know, such an extraordinary place. And Bob Bork, I would tease, but Bob Bork was distinctly the product of the University of Chicago. And I thought that got him into a lot of trouble because I said, look, here you are. You make the strong argument for this, but to try it out. And you say, oh, that wasn't as strong as I thought it was. And I said, I understand what you're doing. I remember when I was teaching at Amherst, and I would say, one of my students, one of my favorite students who came up mid-semester said, wait a minute, you're taking 8 weeks to set up this argument, and then you're taking the rest of the semester to tear it down? Why are you doing that? Well, that's the way we did things in Chicago. You try to make the best case for this author's position, the writer's position, to address not a straw man, to see the best thing, to try to reconcile his inconsistencies. What could be said in saving his argument? And then you go at it, right? That was the style. But Amherst was a place where you could try to say provocative things, and it would really set off a recoil. And but I found there are other ways of saying them within small circles.
So how did you move from international relations and political parties to what you ultimately spent your life in, which is political philosophy, natural law, constitutional law?
Well, of course, as you know, the center of political science is political philosophy. That was the one field that was, as they say, compulsory, required at Chicago. Whatever else you're going to be, you're going to have political theory in it. And those were the central questions. From those questions, everything else radiated. So from foreign policy, the question would come back to the nature of the political regime. And what are the principles that constitute the best political regime? What are the principles that establish what laws you're justified in imposing on the country? What is the nature of those regimes in the foreign arena that pose the gravest threat? What's the nature of those regimes that deserve to be promoted and encouraged, and the nature of those regimes that deserve to be resisted and even removed? So it's a central question that pervaded everything, and of course, over time, your best analogies would come from cases where you're applying principles to particular. You know the attraction of it yourself, because you were drawn to it for the same reason and the same passion. It crystallizes the principles. It's the test of the principles, and it's a test of their truth. But I start to say that just as Socrates was said to have brought philosophy down out of the clouds, it was Harry Jaffa and Walter Burns who brought Strauss down out of the clouds for me, to show how, in Harry's book on Lincoln, The Crisis of the House Divided, to show how the vast tradition of political philosophy could be brought to bear on the gravest crisis in the nature of the American regime, the crisis of the House Divided. And it was all there because you could see, Lincoln, without knowing the bibliography, could tread upon the path taken by Aquinas. As Harry Jaffa would show the parts of Aquinas that Lincoln would sort of reason out on his own, or there's no right to do or wrong, things of that kind, an axiom of that kind. That brought me into. So I do a course in urban politics and try to draw students out. First of all, I show them that the problem of the city is that it's a polis. It's a moral association. It's defined by the laws. It's a regime. And when you see the city in that way, we have in the Gorgias, Plato has Socrates say, I am the only true legislator in Athens. I'm the only one with a political art, because the center of the problem is how to reason about the things that are right or wrong, just or unjust. But Callicles says to Socrates, but you will cut a poor figure in the city, because you'll be hauled in front of a jury and you won't know how to defend yourself. The political art involves at times speaking to the multitude, eliciting the acquiescence or consent of the multitude, a multitude of people who are not philosophers. Remember, so as Lincoln said, they may not be philosophers, but people can understand the central idea. The task of a statesman is to impart the central idea. And you see through those letters of Civil War soldiers on the Union side how Lincoln's lines are often running through their letters in confirming freedom to the slave We are securing freedom to the free. We're all involved in this. You see, there's nothing you could justify the slavery of black people that could not be applied to many whites as well. You can see what a statesman can do, right? Yeah. So if we start teaching on the city, we keep getting drawn back, and I have my students make commitments on a certain battery of cases involving life in the city and aggressive speech, assaulting speech. It used to be understood that when we enter a public place, we can be expected to restrain ourselves out of respect for the sensibilities of other people in the public place. Then the court did a big shift on this with Cohn versus California in 1971, and it was, no, now you're on your own, and anybody who's offended has an obligation to look the other way, develop tougher skin, avert your eye, don't go into the public place. And this would apply to everyone except for pro-life demonstrators. They're the only ones who couldn't benefit from this new regime in which people should be free to speak and others should try to just look the other way and give them lots of room.
How did you get interested in the abortion issue? Or what was the thing that kind of directed you in there? Because not everybody who's interested in political philosophy gravitates toward that issue.
Yeah, it was an issue that was coming up, and I was curious about it, and I was reading, who has since become a very good friend, John Noonan, who was still teaching at the law school at Berkeley, and then became a federal judge, Ninth Circuit under Reagan. And I was reading John, but it was also the conversations with my dear friend Dan Robinson, who's lecturing these days at Oxford. He was one of the few psychologists fluent in Latin and Greek, who's doing laboratory work, and he's one of the founders of neurosciences at Amherst. But he also did another book on Aristotle's psychology for Columbia. And I remember I was getting very concerned about this issue, and I remember talking with Dan, and we were talking about the embryo, and I said, well, God, it looks like a tadpole. He said, it's not a tadpole. Even when it looks like a tadpole. He said, I can take very refined tissue from there, bring it over here, and you'll find an arm growing in a strange place. What made the deepest impression on me was Paul Ramsey, in a piece he had in the chapter he had in that book, the collection of essays that John Noonan assembled, which he started tracing things back. At some point the sole prints appear, the fingerprints appear when swallowing begins, and tracing it all the way back to that zygotal dot, that everything we have genetically, we had at that first moment. The genetic tendencies, perhaps our allergies, perhaps even our SAT scores, were all right there. We have not acquired anything different from what we had then in our genetic definition when we were no larger than the period at the end of this sentence. So you realize now that, I tell students, realize if your mother had disposed of you when you were that zygotal dot, you would not have been the next one. That you alone was you. And I recalled in my book, First Things, when I wrote about it, I recalled that scene in The Third Man. Harry Lime and his friend were at the time, he was selling adulterated penicillin on the black market at the top of the Ferris wheel. And his friend said, do you know what you're doing? Have you seen the babies? And he said, look down at those, the dots. Those people there are dots. Now if I told you you can have $20,000 tax-free for every dot that was removed, would you just tell me to keep my money? Or figure out how many dots you thought you could afford? He said, well, it may look like a dot. It's not a dot. It's a small thing, but it's not a dot. But we began to reason about this, as you've heard me on this, simply through the model of principled reasoning that Lincoln often, would tell audiences and people that Aquinas said that the divine law we know through revelation, but the natural law we know through that reasoning that is natural to you, accessible to human beings as human beings. And so Lincoln had this fragment, just a fragment he wrote for himself, in which he was imagining himself engaged in a conversation with an owner of black slaves and saying, why are you justified in making a slave of the black man? Is it because you think he's less intelligent than you? Ah, beware, the next white man that comes along, more intelligent than you, may rightly enslave you. Is it because he's darker than you, the lighter having the right to enslave the darker? Ah, beware again, the next white man that comes along, with a complexion even lighter than yours, may rightly enslave you. Oh, it's in your interest to do it. It may be in somebody else's interest to enslave you. Now, the upshot was that there was nothing you could cite to justify the enslavement of black people that would not apply to many whites as well. And I would point out to people, nowhere in the chain of reasoning was there an appeal to revelation or faith, right? This is simply natural law reasoning, right? It was accessible to people across the religious divide. Catholics, Baptists, atheists. And we point out it's precisely the same argument we use in regard to abortion. Why is that offspring of the womb anything less than human? Doesn't speak it. Well, neither do deaf mutes. Doesn't have arms or legs. Other people lose arms or legs in the course of their lives without losing anything necessary to their standing as human beings to receive the protections of the law. Now, once again, there's no appeal to faith or reason, or to faith, rather, or religious belief. It is simply principled reasoning, which is to say you don't have to be Catholic to understand this argument. But that, of course, is precisely the teaching of the Church, that you don't have to be Catholic to understand this argument. It is natural law reasoning. It is a combination of its principled reasoning joined with the evidence of embryology. Right? Now, curiously, there's so many people who say they were turned when they came, and we taught about this in a course of mine called Political Obligations, which turned itself into the book First Things, which would start with Aristotle and Lincoln and Douglas and natural rights, and we'd work our way in it. The culminating point would be the life issues. Everything would culminate there. Okay. Now, the interesting thing about this, filling out the biography, is that I would get these letters from people, like my dear student Ned Desmond, working for Time magazine and stationed in the Far East. I had a letter from him in Tokyo saying, you know, that work we did in that course on natural law actually brought me back to the Church. And what I've just described, how people come to the issue of abortion, it's not that this is really actually it's a remarkably representative account, because I came later into the Church. Came into the Church in 2000. Many people reading me thought I was Catholic already. So I'm a Jewish
non-Catholic in the country.
Yeah, Jewish Catholic, and but I'm getting these letters since I've become, and I mentioned some of the people who came in. I'm getting more letters from my former students saying that actually I did come in. I did come into the Church, and it was the natural law argument. The fact there's truth on these things. There is a truth here. There really are truths out there, and people now gravitate to the Church that became the main sanctuary for truth. So John Paul II would say, if it weren't for the connection to Greek philosophy, we could have gone the way of the Ayatollahs. Ralph McInerney used to make that point a lot. If it weren't for Thomas, we could have gone the way of the Ayatollahs. That with the connection to Greek philosophy, so as John Paul II said, it kept us from divinizing nature or converting religion into superstition. So it's faith and reason. One
of the great ironies, I think, of intellectual life at the end of the 20th century is that you have a brilliant intellectual pope like John Paul II, writing as head of the Catholic Church, writing an encyclical like Fides et Ratio, Faith and Reason, in which he tries to persuade the modern world to have faith in reason. Not just have faith in faith, but even to trust their reason. And it's just the irony of that is so striking.
When you and I face this, the cases on religion and the law, and you say, people say, well, religious arguments ought to be kept out of the public sphere of any kind of taint of religion. You say, well, you take a look at, in the schools of philosophy, they come to reject the notion that there are moral truths anchoring our arguments. Well, if there are no moral truths behind, if all your arguments are really anchored in beliefs, then why would the beliefs of the secular stand on any higher epistemic plane than the beliefs of the religious, if it's simply a matter of beliefs?
Yeah.
You know, and
there's as much faith in secularism as there is faith in religion.
And of course, yeah, there's more, because they reject the notion that there are moral truths anchoring these things. So actually, with this short space, you really brought the distance I've traversed and how it's come. So it all began with some of those conversations in which these moral arguments were arising out of what I was doing, and I was now sort of marking the 40, I don't say celebrating, marking the 40th anniversary of Roe versus Wade. I just written a piece I submitted to commentary, arguing that the court was just going to sustain the usual restraints on abortion, the laws that restrain abortion. So I started writing. I finally did something for the Wall Street Journal during the campaign of 1976, an article on abortion. That brought the attention of many people. I started getting invitations to speak in Detroit and other places, and soon got a reputation on the pro-life circuit, and began traveling those circles and involved in pro-life leadership groups. And so willy-nilly, before long, I was very much engaged in it. And the Born Alive Act, the so-called Born Alive Act, came out of. Did you want to talk about that at all? Or?
I definitely want to talk about the Born Alive Act. It's a fascinating story.
Yeah, it is. The title is awful. It's one of those. The way they give these titles to legislative acts, they string together nouns as adjectives. The Born Alive Infants Protection Act. You know, but this came out of the work in the pro-life movement, and I'd written a draft of something for the debating kit of the first George Bush when he was preparing for the debates with Michael Dukakis in 1988. And I would have had Mr. Bush take this line, something he could have taken very usefully in 1989 when the court came forth with the Webster case, in which it looked as though it was returning the question of abortion to the political arena. Well, at that moment, there were pro-life politicians who panicked. Oh my God, I'm going to have to actually vote on it. And suddenly, a guy, Jim Carter in New Jersey, he could be pro-life as long as he knew he was safely detached from the authority to do anything about it. Suddenly, he was getting these alarming telegrams and calls from constituents. You're going to dispossess me of a right that I think is now fundamental, an anchor of my personal freedom and privacy. So he did a 180-degree flip. At that moment, you needed a president, a leader of the party, to just hold things together, to get them through the day, and keep them from panicking. And at that moment, what I had written for Mr. Bush would have been just perfect. But it'd say, look, we have a moment, this may be returned to the political arena, where ordinary people could vote on this again, and we can take votes. But this matter has been ruled by the courts so long that we probably need a conversation among us before we start legislating. The other side insists that abortion is not infanticide, which means they're willing to protect the child at some point. Why don't we just invite them to tell us where they'd like to begin? And why don't we begin there? And if nothing else, why not birth? How about the point of birth? Because as you point out yesterday, we had this decision in South Carolina in 1977 in the federal court with Judge Hainsworth of a child who'd undergone an abortion, come through an abortion, survived an abortion, undergone surgery, lived for 20 days, died. And the question was put, was there an obligation to preserve the life of this child? And the answer tendered by Judge Hainsworth was, no. This is not a child protected by state law, he said. It was a fetus marked for termination.
The right to an abortion is the right to a dead baby.
Right to an effective abortion or a dead baby, right? So I said, why don't we begin by rejecting that? Why don't we invite people to join us in rejecting that? And that would mark the outer limits of this. Well, the pro-life people, I finally got people in the pro-life movement, the pro-life leaders, to shine onto it. But National Right to Life did not want to go along with it because they thought it was just too easy. It was too modest. And of course, you of course, we were writing very early because you saw what I was up to, what I was doing with us. We're simply trying to plant a premise. And we didn't conceal it. We said, we're going to be right back. We think if you give us this premise, that even the child marked for an abortion has a claim to the protections of the law. And it must mean she has a claim to the protections of the law that cannot pivot on whether anyone wants her. And if that's the case, she must have some intrinsic dignity that cannot be contingent on how she affects the interests of other people or her location. Okay. So he said, once we establish this, then of course we're going to be back to you later to ask you what's different about that same child 5 minutes earlier, 5 days, 5 weeks, 5 months earlier. We're going to try to persuade you every inch along the way. But of course, if we don't persuade you, we don't persuade you. And from that vast volume of 1.3 million abortions each year, we may rescue a handful of lives. And we thought there's nothing trifling about that. I had a dear friend in Boston who used to say that late friend, who's Joe Stanton, who said, after all this effort, we've saved only a handful of lives. It will all be worth it. It will all be worth it. So we didn't conceal that that's what we're up to, but we invited people to join the natural right to life people thought it was just too modest, and even pro-choice congressmen would vote for it and claim credit for the pro-lifers, and some pro-lifers would be credulous enough to believe them. But Doug Johnson at National Right to Life found something equivalent: the partial birth abortion, a grisly procedure at the very point of birth with 70% of the child dangling out of the birth canal, and then, of course, that awful procedure. They crush the head of the child, suck out the brains, so they can remove the child, so to speak, intact. Well, that went down, though. It was doing the work. It was drawing attention to people who didn't know. As I said, it was a teaching bill because people didn't know that under the reigning doctrines of Roe versus Wade and Doe versus Bolton, you can have an abortion for the entire length of the pregnancy.
Yeah, people didn't understand that.
No, I remember I told you I had Gene Rostow, the former dean of the law school at Yale. He was at my dinner table in Bethesda. I was just shocked when he thought that you can have abortion only the first trimester. What did he know? He's the dean of the law school, and he reads the New York Times. Why would he know any different? And Marianne Glendon at Harvard surveyed 25 of her colleagues, and only 5 of them could give an accurate account of what was in Roe versus Wade, and so Doe versus Bolton. So we thought we'd break out a lot. First of all, the effect of the bill was to break out information that most of the public would find jolting. That's what we're doing. Well, when the bill on partial birth abortion was struck down in Nebraska, and by implication 31 other states, by the Supreme Court in June 2000, the prospects for the partial birth abortion bill were just nil. And it was in the middle of a presidential campaign. So Doug Johnson thought, okay, now what else can we do? Let's go back to Hadley's bill. And Dick Posner, in the great Richard Posner,
Judge for the Seventh Circuit.
Judge in the Seventh Circuit. I said Sixth Circuit. Yeah, I was wrong. Seventh Circuit, Chicago. Mm-hmm. He tweeted us during his dissent in the Wisconsin case on partial birth abortion. Yeah. He said, well, you people never make the claim to protect the child herself, so why does the state have any compelling interest in shifting the killing of the child back from the birth canal to the uterus? And he had a point. So I said, let's fill in that point. So the line I used was the line from Andrew Jackson in the Battle of New Orleans when he supposedly said, boys, I want you to elevate them guns a little lower. Right? Let's draw back. I want you to be a little more modest. Let's just protect that child. Whatever you think was in Roe versus Wade, it surely cannot mean the right to a dead baby. Okay? Can we not accept that? Well, to the utter astonishment, we came forth with the bill in July 2000, and they gave me the privilege of leading the testimony in the Judiciary Committee of the House, with Charles Kennedy as chairing the subcommittee of the Constitution. Well, Doug Johnson was absolutely astonished and just smiling ear to ear because the National Organization of Women came out in opposition. He couldn't believe they would do that, come out in opposition to the bill to preserve the life of the child born alive. Are you kidding? And the feminists were keen on it. And I said, it's one of the ironies of this whole business that our adversaries understood this bill better than some of my allies. Like Henry Hyde would say, why is this worth doing? It's really so modest. Actually, because we're planting premises, see. And so my point is that the adversaries understood this bill because they saw the principle that lay at the heart of the thing. They saw that. Yes. And Jerry Nadler had to tell them, Congressman Nadler from Greenwich Village would say, look, just don't make us vote against this thing. It's a very modest bill. Don't give these people the argument that only draws attention to the bill. We want the we wanted the argument. So the bill sailed through the markup 22-1 with only Mel Watts of North Carolina voting against it. And then it was coming to the House, and it was just going through too easily. We wanted the argument. So for the sake of raising the level of tension, we decided we'd go back to an old tradition of adding preambles to the bills to explain what the purpose and the premises were. So we'd say, and we said, by the way, if we have this wrong, tell us why we have it wrong and amend it. But it seems to us you can't vote coherently for this bill unless you think that even the child marked for an abortion has a claim to the protection of the law that cannot pivot on whether anyone wants her. Now, do we have that wrong? Are you protecting the child only because it pleases you to protect the child? Would you cease to protect her when it ceased to please you? Well, if that's what you mean, amend this, tell us. But if you're not amending it, then it seems to us you must be saying that the child then must have some intrinsic dignity of her own that can't depend on her location or whether she serves the interests of anyone else. Okay, so we had the preamble, and the backers wanted the preamble. We did raise the level of tension, but it was among the Republicans before we even got to the Democrats. A group of moderate Republicans demanded a meeting with the leadership, and they threatened to go to the floor and they threatened to join with the Democrats in adjourning the Congress if we went to the floor with that inflammatory preamble. They're ready to do this at the height of the presidential election and to embarrass their own party. And Charles Kennedy said, wait a minute, you think there's a constituency for infanticide back home in your district? Well, you know, what happens at moments like this is the leadership tries to calm people down. We'll round off something here and there. But Henry Hyde decided, no, we've got to give in to them because here's Kai Kendall in Los Angeles. We work on the assumption that every member is the sovereign judge of what makes life difficult for him back in his district. For the sake of preserving a Republican Congress and a pro-life Congress, we need a lot of these pro-choice Republicans. It's just, it's true. The Democrats land on the other side. They need pro-life Democrats to use, Robert Casey as their useful idiot. Okay, so Henry decided, okay, no, we'll throw out the preamble. So it goes to the floor and it brings in a vote of 380 to 15. Well, everything got stalled for the presidential election, and then things came. We had to do this again in 2001. And Charles Kennedy was gone, and Jim Sensenbrenner took over as chairman. And I mentioned only for this point that we wanted, okay, let's do the preamble again. And Jim said, no, Henry brought this bill in at 380 to 15. We want to be a stronger performance as Henry. And we said, we're not interested in the box score. We're not interested in the box score. We want the argument. But it didn't go. So it goes to the floor. It gets, I think, just 2 Republican votes are lost, Nancy Walker and Ben Gilman from New York. And it goes to the Senate is still in Democratic hands. And yet it's brought to the floor by Harry Reid, the deputy majority leader. And it passes with unanimous, not a single Democratic vote in opposition. It passes. And we're assembled in Pittsburgh for the signing of the bill. And I was invited, White House invited me in for the signing, because, it was my baby, so to speak. And Karl Rove, I'm losing the name, that good guy was chief of staff, Andy Card and Karl Rove come up, and Karl says, how do you figure that the Democrats allowed that bill to get to the floor? And I said, what's your surmise, Carl? He said, I only figures they must have thought that somebody out there cared about this, and there'd be a price to pay if they didn't pass it. And I said, well, you know, that's interesting. There you go. The other side attributing more seriousness to our people than is really warranted, because no one would have paid any political capital among the Republicans to rescue that bill. It's just remarkable how they could have read it. Then later on, Karl Rove wrote me and he said, an email from Karl saying, that was such a simple and elegant bill. And do you have anything else like that? I said, are you kidding? Of course. We've got, you know, the next couple of steps. But the curious thing here is
what would some of those steps be, Hadley?
Oh, the steps part of it I mentioned yesterday, that I just wanted, that even executive order, the bill on partial birth abortion was being enjoined in the federal courts. So while it's being enjoined, that's a bill that enjoined barring the surgery. Well, that's out. We said, wait a minute, still, while it's being practiced, American taxpayers should not be compelled to be accomplices in a procedure that 70–80% of the public regard as abhorrent. So let's simply say that we'll remove federal funds from any hospital or clinic that houses this procedure. Well, this is not what. This is the way that the federal government has been extended over the last 40 to 50 years in accord with a liberal agenda. We offer grants for the federal government. We don't know how the federal government reaches any of this stuff, but we give you a grant for birth counseling. Birth counseling? Federal government doing birth counseling in the central cities, building housing. We do it by extending grants, and if you accept the grant, the federal rules come along. If you don't accept the grant, well, nothing's binding on you. It's no law. You don't have to justify it. So we say, okay, let's do this. Almost any of these facilities would be dependent on federal funds, and I'd ask to have the president pose the question. This is the thing he'd do. It doesn't even require an executive order. But you'd set off crippling tensions among the Democrats if you did it. Say, tell me, do the formulas of the Civil Rights Acts apply to these hospitals? The Civil Rights Restoration Act. The youngster gets a loan from the federal government, takes it to a school. The whole place becomes a recipient of federal funds. Milton Friedman said ways ago, it's like saying somebody walks into A&P with food stamps, the A&P becomes a recipient of federal funds. Okay, but that's the construction. Okay, so, and then all the federal rules apply. So I have Mr. Bush ask them, just put the question to the Judiciary Committee. If somebody tell me what is a recipient of federal funds? If somebody walks into a hospital or clinic and he happens to be covered by Medicare, if he's getting Social Security, he's getting a refund from the IRS. Is the whole place now a recipient of federal funds? And do we have now grounds for removing federal funds from the whole establishment? Now, all Mr. Bush had to do was raise that question. No executive order, just raise it. And you would have set off crippling tensions among the Democrats, because they knew that if they'd let us do with this, we could legislate against abortion all the way down the line. We could drive. They had to resist. But if they resisted, they'd have to resist by starting to dismantle the whole formula by which the reach of the federal government had been extended over 40, 50 years. They couldn't do that. But if they tried to resist us, they'd have to resist on the worst terrain possible for them, defending their worst case that elicited the opposition of 70 to 80% of the public. So I told Carl, well, this is win-win. Do you want to dismantle the whole scheme? We'll help them, right? This is playing the political game. You set off these tensions, these crippling tensions in the opposition. If they had us in this position, they'd have been squeezing hard. Mm-hmm. Our guys don't play that game.
Another example would be sex-selective abortions.
Yeah, we're for that. Sex-selective abortion, anything like that. We're doing that right now. Our guys are doing that right now. But interesting, go back to the Bushes for a moment. I know Robbie George's line about the first George Bush, that his problem for the pro-lifers, that he was all action and no talk, and we needed to talk. That memorable day, you remember, in 1989, the Webster case, when it looked as though the court was taking the first steps to return the issue of abortion to the political arena, and maybe you could protect the child even before the point of viability. Reporters rushed to President Bush, who was on the golf course, and so moved by the moment that he was not quite moved to remove the wooden tee between his teeth. And he said, we'll have a statement for you later on that. See, that was the moment in which you needed the talk of a president who frames the issue, to avert panic among those pro-life Republicans who didn't know where to go. You give them something. We're going to start a conversation on this. I'm going to start with something very modest. You people in New Jersey will not be inflamed by the fact that we're going to protect the child born alive. Let's start something. This is what you tell your constituents. Don't worry, we're going to do this all very gradually and try to do this in a conversation. So I thought that this issue would be the easiest for George W. Bush, that there are Republicans in New Jersey and Connecticut who'd like to vote Republican were not for this vexing issue of abortion getting in the way. And I thought that George W. could go into Connecticut, New Jersey, and say, look, I know we disagree on many things, but can't we at least agree on this minimal thing? But he never used it at all. And in fact, he never even endorsed this minimal bill. The endorsement came from the executive office of the president in the executive office building. And so when you wonder why, because he did endorse the bill on partial birth abortion, my own surmise was the bill on partial birth abortion was already on the scene. It was there. It'd been there for a while. Several years have been talked about, so it's already much in play. But to talk about something new betrayed a willingness to talk about these things. And in the circles in which Mr. Bush moved, it was considered kind of tawdry to talk about things like this. And I thought that this was one of the problems for the pro-life. That this is what the odd rule. The other side knows that the Republicans get very, a friend of mine says, Ed Nate says, goosey. They get goosey talking about these things that they're nervous talking about. They don't want to talk about them. The other side knows they don't want to talk about them, and that virtually guarantees that the media will come at them, making them talk about them, and moving them into all kinds of unforced errors. And that, as I was arguing yesterday, is one of the sources of our problems. That the pro-life issues, the issues of the life issues, marriage, are net winners for the conservative side when they're raised.
Anything that gets the country talking about abortion, thinking about it, arguing about it, reasoning about it, is really something to our benefit. Because
that's absolutely right.
People have to address the question. It means, people can't ignore it. They can't push it under the rug, sweep it under the rug.
Right.
Which is, that's the victory for the pro-abortion side. When it's so normalized, it doesn't even get talked about. It just gets pushed into a corner so that we don't have to confront the issue head on. We don't have to look at what it is exactly that we're doing when we end the life of that being.
That's right. It's just one of those things that it's hardly worth talking about anymore. We just all accept the rightness of it. Yeah. We said nothing is said to call it all into question. Yeah. Right?
Let me transition now just for a few minutes, talk a little bit about natural law and the principles of American government, because you've certainly been one of the premier defenders of a kind of natural law interpretation of American political principles. And yet, in general, there's not a lot of discussion of natural law in American society today. So talk a little bit about the importance of the role of natural law in American political principles.
Yeah, actually, I heard somebody said there's not much talk about natural law in American law these days, and Dan Robinson remarked, yeah, there hasn't been much discussion of the alphabet either, but it seems to be it seems to be running through everything we do. Well, there are a couple of levels in which you could do. Dick Posner once remarked that these misunderstandings of natural law, that infanticide seems to be, and incest seem to be, intractable parts of the human experience. Therefore, they must be planted in something deep in human nature. They spring from something in human nature. Therefore, they must be in accord with natural law. As though natural law gives us just a generalization about the checkered record of our species. And Kant warned about this about years ago, but you don't make your way to these principles by simply giving generalizations on what people have done. The natural law tradition has always made a distinction between what is higher and lower in human nature. Remember Lincoln invoking those better angels of our nature, right? Things that are higher or lower. Our capacity to reflect about the rightness or wrongness of our ends is higher than our brute animal strength, There's recognition of this. But also, people attach themselves, thinking there's a difference between natural law, with the accent on duties, and natural rights, with Hobbes, and with Thomas Hobbes. But Hobbes, detached rights entirely from any moral dimensions to the problem. But those of us who work in this field talk about these rights in accord with nature, with human beings. You just have a sense of there's certain objective truths planted in nature. And to take it back to its rudiments for the American regime, it's actually does follow Aristotle, that we work our way to the things that are distinctively human by separating human things from the things that are subhuman or superhuman. So Aristotle says, anyone who's outside of polis, anyone who doesn't need the restraints of the law, must either be a beast or a god. He's above it. He doesn't need the restraints. An animal, he's just insensitive to the moral teachings of the law, right? So as the argument ran at the founding, just as the founders said, so that no man is by nature the ruler of other men, in the way that God is by nature the ruler of men. And the town of Malden says, monarchy would be the only fitting form of government for God in relation to human beings, but not for one man among others. Or James Wilson saying, supreme authority would be justified in the case of he who is supreme, but not among these sublunary creatures. And the other thought was, no man is by nature the ruler of other men, the way God is by nature the ruler of men. Men are by nature the ruler of dogs and horses. If we come to a state of affairs in which some men are ruling over others, that can arise from nature, it must arise from convention or consent. The only rightful government is that which draws its just powers from the consent of the governed. And Jefferson said, anyone who rejects that must assume that the mass of mankind were born with spurs on, mass of mankind were born with saddles on their backs, and the privileged few were born with spurs on, ready to ride them. Right? And then 2 years later, Douglas says in the debate with Lincoln that if it comes down to a matter between the white man and the black man, I am decisively on the side of the white man. But if it ever came down to dispute between the black man and the crocodile, I'm for the black man. And Lincoln, who didn't have the advantage of analogies tests, Lincoln said, what Douglas is telling you is that the black man is to the white man the way the crocodile is to the black man. The only way he can remove from black people the rights that would flow to human beings by nature, not to be ruled only with their consent, the only way he could make the case for removing from black people those rights would be by assimilating black people to the things that are subhuman. Now, those are the themes that run through Lincoln's rhetoric and his argument with Douglas. But for our time, we point out to people that Lincoln said, all honor to Jefferson who articulated an abstract truth applicable to all men and all times. Barack Obama invokes the Declaration of Independence, all men are created equal, but doesn't believe it's a truth. He said in his inauguration, well, it's a matter of historical experience, which means that 10 years from now, 100 years from now, that one may not be true. And we've been put the question with Lincoln. We thought these rights were grounded in the nature that separates human beings from other animals and from God. We think that 100 years from now, that nature will remain the same. These rights will be the same in all places of the world, all cultures so-called, in which that nature remains the same. And so we may say, even in this age of animal liberation, we still don't sign labor contracts with horses or cows. We don't think it makes sense to seek the informed consent of our household pets before we authorize surgery on them. But we continue to think that those beings who can give and understand reasons over matters of right and wrong deserve to be ruled with reasons in a regime that elicits their consent. And politicians have an incentive to give people reasons. So now we ask, 100 years from now, you think those parts of nature will be changed? Do you think we will be signing labor contracts with dogs and horses and so on? Well, if you think that will remain the same, then you give the answer to Joe Ellis from Mount Holyoke, who said, well, how could you believe this thing written at the end of the 18th century could articulate a truth that could plunk down here at the end of the 20th century, beginning of the 21st? Don't we know that all knowledge is all moral knowledge is historically based, except for the doctrine of historical relativism, right? Right. That will hold true. That will hold true across the historical epics.
The self-referential argument is always so powerful.
Yes. Yeah. So but the wonder of it all. So again, you find the founders talked about things you grasp per se note as axioms. So we tell people. Two contradictory propositions both cannot be. You've got to grasp that before you grasp anything else. Now, if I say two contradictory propositions both cannot be true, and I say, and Aquinas said it, do I add anything to this? Now I say, it's Pythagorean theory, but Pythagoras said it. It doesn't depend now on Pythagoras's opinion or his credential. Now I say, two contradictory propositions both cannot be true, and it's in the Second Amendment. I haven't added anything to it. Okay. Now let's say I start saying things like, Alexander Hamilton would say, we work on this rule of construction, said it was 78. Any later statute supersedes an earlier one. But that's not the rule of construction we work with the Constitution, because the Constitution coming earlier must be able to override the statute coming later, or else it loses its function as a control on the legislative power. And Hamilton says, how do we know this? It's not in the positive law of the Constitution. The reason and nature of the thing. So we say, now look, if I say, take that one of the first principles of moral judgment that James Wilson mentions, I would rephrase like this. We cast moral judgments on people only in the domain of freedom, where they actually have some control over their own acts, so that we don't hold people blameworthy or responsible for acts they were powerless to control. If Smith wasn't born at the time the crime was committed, we take that powerful evidence for it. If Smith is thrown out the window and on the way down lands on Jones, we don't hold Smith responsible for an assault. Okay. If Smith wasn't in control of himself, somebody else was hypnotized, he's not culpable. Okay. Well, that proposition is nowhere in the Constitution, nor is presumed innocent or proven guilty. How do we know it? So we say, well, they are axioms. The founders would just trace their judgments back to these things that had to be in place before you had this document. Now we have judges saying, well, can the Constitution just secure some of these rights or some of these axioms? We say that's rather like the question of do I have to use syntax when I order coffee? It's implicit in everything you do. Those principles are there. And of course, if they're principles of reason, like law of contradiction, we don't hold people blameworthy for acts they were powerless to effect. Of course they're there, and you recognize them. Now, my friend Scalia would say, they're there because part of the common law is tradition. And then the old question is it true because many of our people have believed it for a long time and made it, or have we made it traditional because it is true? See, there's no way of getting around that main question.
Yeah. Well, thanks for tuning in today to hear Hadley Arkes, a great pro-life and natural law scholar who has done so much to put the natural law at the center of serious intellectual discussion about the principles of the American regime, and who has especially applied it to these fundamental issues about the right to life, which is certainly one of the most fundamental issues of American government. And so we hope this serves as a stimulus to go back and look at that natural law tradition, which is such an important framework for our life.